Now, my next guest has been a friend of mine for more than 30 years. He's the co-editor of Friends of Socialist China, and he has worked as a consultant on Chinese affairs for many, many years. It's been my experience that there's nothing about China, its history and its present, that Keith Bennett doesn't know. And I'm glad to say he joins us on the first edition of the midweek mother of all talk shows. Keith, thanks for that. You may have been surprised, as I was, to discover from The Sun that the British state now, from this day, designates China as a threat. What can that possibly mean?
It's a very good question. I think, like a lot of these things that are upcoming, they're a surprise at the moment they are happening, but actually they've been well signaled in advance. And I think it's actually quite difficult to work out what's really meant by it beyond showmanship. In terms of it being a policy of Liz Truss, I mean, you would normally dismiss any opinion held by Liz Truss as being that of an idiot, which is not really worth commenting on. The only reason it's worth commenting on is that she happens, for the moment at least, to be the Prime Minister. But it reflects, and I think, a worldview that she's articulated for the last decade and a bit, at least, in the book that she wrote with some other Tory dinosaurs, Britannia Unchained, which really seeks to get behind the United States even more so than most mainstream politicians in Britain do. And that, as you know, from your own experience, not least, is something that takes some doing, but she's seems to want to do it. And we've seen starting not with Donald Trump, starting at least with Obama, followed on by Trump, followed even more so by Biden, that the United States has ripped up decades of, more or less cooperative relations with China. Some, always ups and downs, but basically cooperative relations in favor of a new Cold War. And Liz Truss is seeking to get behind that. It's it's an extraordinary.
China has done nothing to warrant this, has it? What harm has China ever done to us?
Well, in my opinion, absolutely none. I mean, China has, as you say, done nothing to warrant this behavior, and I think it's it is an extraordinary turnaround. I was watching the show earlier before I was called on, and you referred to how David Cameron and George Osborne, just 7 years ago, 2015, when Xi Jinping made his state visit, declared that there was a golden era in China-Britain relations. George Osborne was saying that there was no area of the British economy that wasn't open to foreign investment. A Chinese investment. He was boasting that Britain was the most open country to investment with China. He was practically rattling a begging bowl in Beijing. And when Xi Jinping came on his state visit, he didn't just get the golden coach down the Mall. He and David Cameron were up in Manchester having selfies with Sergio Aguero at Manchester City. He was taken by Cameron to the local pub nearest to Chequers for a pint and fish and chips. It's a bit of a come down from a state banquet in Beijing, but never mind. And it's the same. People seem to forget it's the same government, it's the same political party that's in power that has made this reversal, and China really hasn't changed at all in that period. I mean, Liz Truss herself, in her otherwise forgettable ministerial career, at one time she was extolling the virtues of selling as much British cheese as possible to the Chinese market. Another time she was in Shanghai saying that we're terrible at teaching maths in the UK and we need to bring Chinese teachers over to the UK. Now she wants to have this Cold War, at least, with China. And as you say, it's not China that is sailing gunboats up the Channel and through the Solent. It's Britain that's got the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal with Australia and the United States to threaten China. It's Britain that's sending its warships through the Taiwan Straits, through Chinese territorial waters. If there was any country in this equation that should be saying that this country is our enemy, it's China that should be saying it about Britain, yet it's the other way round.
In a sane country, the media at least would be asking, well, were the Tories wrong then, or are they wrong now? They can't have been right on both occasions. It cannot have been right 7 years ago to basically lie down with your backside in the air for the Chinese and welcoming them to a golden era. And yet 7 years on, they are a threat. We must have been wrong on one of those occasions, because no one can point to, and you certainly haven't pointed to, anything that China has done differently in the last 7 years in which our policy has turned 180 degrees.
China hasn't done anything differently, but I think the point that's to be made about the press is that it's actually not that people like Liz Truss and hangers-on like Tom Tugendhat or Ian Duncan Smith, not that they need much encouragement, but the press is cheering them on. Liberal press like The Guardian is cheering them on, and of course the right-wing press, the Mail, the Telegraph, the Times, and so on. I mean, it was very interesting that in order to try and rescue his Tory leadership campaign, Rishi Sunak had to enter a race to the bottom about who could be tougher and more hostile to China. Whereas, just a year ago, in his Mansion House speech on 1st of July 2021, Rishi Sunak struck a very different note to what Liz Truss did when she spoke at Mansion House in April 2022, when Rishi Sunak said, too often the debate on China lacks nuance. Well, if we're talking about the debate in the Tory party, or indeed the Labour Party, or in the British media, that's certainly true. And Rishi Sunak says the truth is, China is both one of the most important economies in the world and a state with fundamentally different values to ours. We need a mature and balanced relationship. Fair enough. He had to resile on that. He had to compete with Truss as to who could say the most ridiculous things about China to try and salvage his campaign. And the Mail and the Telegraph were chewing him over as being allegedly soft on China, talking about how many thousands of people his father-in-law employs in China through his the software company Infosys, and so on. So you have this kind of, where the press should be holding government to account, you have them actually joined in an unholy alliance.
Yeah, it's a kind of schizophrenia, but it's a self-harming one. We've moved into now, as a result of this designation, a period of self-harm. In the days when I used to regularly give speeches in universities, I wouldn't go near one now, it was full of Chinese students. In the days when I used to speak at very expensive private schools in England, they were full of Chinese schoolgirls and schoolboys. The Chinese invested in our nuclear energy. I wish we'd done more to build it up. They invested in so many parts of our economy. They're not likely to be queuing up to invest now, are they?
Well, I think a lot of Chinese business would still like to invest in the UK. It's just that they business doesn't like instability, and Chinese business people are very worried about the atmosphere here. As you say, so many, Britain basically privatized its higher education, and it's been relying on overseas student fees. The biggest number of those are from China. I live in Dulwich, and we've got one of the most expensive public schools in the country just round the corner from me, Dulwich College. You walk through Dulwich, you hear Mandarin being spoken, but increasingly, Chinese parents, and bearing in mind most Chinese parents, because of the policy pursued in China for a few decades, most Chinese parents have only one child. They're very precious, and they're thinking, do we really want to send them to this country where COVID is not taken seriously, where they're under risk of racial attacks, where our country is being traduced? This is an example of self-harm. It's the same with in terms of the economy. There's at least 150,000 British jobs that are dependent on economic links with China. It's not just the nuclear. British Steel would have gone out of business had it not been acquired by a Chinese company. Now, because of British government policy, that investment is at risk. If British Steel closes, it's going to be devastating in Scunthorpe. This is the leveling up that we're getting. We're actually wiping out bits of productive industry through short-sighted foreign policy.
I know that Beijing doesn't wait up for the first editions of The Sun, but what will the reaction in China be in government circles when they finally get around to reading it?
Well, there's a daily press conference of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and the young lady who's the latest foreign affairs spokesperson was asked about this. And I mean, obviously she refuted and dismissed the charges that were made, but she concluded, I think, with a very telling point. She said that pointing the finger at China will not help the UK to solve its own deep-seated problems.
Well, that's masterful understatement, the kind of understatement we used to be famous for ourselves. Keith Bennett, China specialist, co-editor of Friends of Socialist China, thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows on this historic occasion.